The hangar reeked of burnt metal and failure. 72 hours. That's how long Fort Bragg's top engineers had stared at the dead Apache engine, their advanced degrees useless against $40 million of silent steel. Colonel Rebecca Hayes watched them pack their tools, her jaw tight. The mission clock ticked down. Then she did something that made her second-in-command freeze mid-sentence. She picked up the phone and asked for maintenance. Not the engineering team, not the contractors, the night janitor. The man in stained coveralls who emptied trash cans at 3 a.m. while pushing a yellow mop cart nobody looked at twice. Trevor Walsh arrived with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much. The engineers smirked. They didn't know those hands had once designed the very aircraft they couldn't fix, or why a legend had chosen to disappear into the shadows of a military base, mopping floors to pay for his dying son's hospital bills. What happened next would shatter everything they thought they knew about genius, sacrifice, and the invisible people walking among them. 3:15 in the morning. Trevor Walsh's universe consisted of bucket water gone cold, the rhythmic squeak of mop wheels on concrete, and the particular silence that came when everyone else had gone home. He moved through Hangar 7 the way ghosts move through walls, present but unnoticed, existing in that gray space between midnight and dawn when the base belonged to no one. The Apache helicopter dominated the center of the hangar like a wounded predator. Panels hung open, exposing the complexity beneath the sleek military skin. Work lights blazed down on the engine compartment where 3 engineers huddled, their voices carrying sharp frustration across the empty space. Trevor kept to the perimeter, pushing his mop cart in practiced patterns that kept him invisible. 6 years of this work had taught him how to occupy a room without disturbing its more important inhabitants. "It makes no sense," one engineer said, his voice edged with exhaustion. "Every test comes back normal. Every system passes diagnostic. But the turbine won't engage." Trevor's hands tightened on the mop handle. Something in the engineer's description triggered a memory. Knowledge rising up from a place he'd spent 6 years trying to drown. He forced it down. This wasn't his problem. Hadn't been his problem since the day he'd traded his aerospace credentials for coveralls that smelled like industrial cleaner and defeat. He moved closer despite himself, unable to completely silence the part of his brain that still thought like an engineer. From this angle, he could see into the engine compartment, see the turbine assembly, the control units, the maze of cables and connections that transformed fuel into flight. His eyes traced the pathways automatically, analyzing without permission, seeing patterns the conscious part of his mind didn't want to acknowledge. There. A cable bundle running parallel to the fuel sensor housing. Wrong placement. Too close. The kind of mistake that happened when production schedules mattered more than engineering specifications. The kind of mistake he'd warned against in design reviews back when people listened to him, back when he was Dr. Trevor Walsh instead of just Walsh. The night janitor nobody remembered to say good morning to. "We're shutting it down," the lead engineer announced, defeat heavy in his voice. "This is beyond our capability. We need manufacturer support, and that's going to take time we don't have." Trevor pushed his cart past them, heading for the exit. Not his problem. He had 3 more buildings to clean before his shift ended. Then the drive to Womack Medical Center where his son Randy lay hooked to machines, his 9-year-old body fighting a battle it was slowly losing. The base's helicopter problems were irrelevant compared to that arithmetic of heartbeats and hospital bills. Cold air slapped him when he stepped outside. November in North Carolina carried teeth, especially at 3:30 in the morning when exhaustion made everything colder. Trevor loaded his cart into the maintenance truck, an ancient vehicle that coughed and wheezed like it sympathized with his general condition. The engine finally caught, and he sat for a moment, letting the anemic heater blow its best effort at warmth. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. Trevor's stomach dropped the way it always did now. Unknown numbers meant the hospital, and hospital calls in the middle of the night meant things he couldn't afford to think about. He answered with hands gone suddenly unsteady. "Mr. Walsh?" A woman's voice, crisp and authoritative. Military bearing even through phone speakers. "This is Colonel Rebecca Hayes. I need you to return to Hangar 7 immediately. Trevor's mind spun through possibilities. Had he missed something? Left a door unlocked? A light burning? Some critical error in the janitor duties that apparently defined his entire existence? Ma'am, I'm scheduled for the administration building. I can come back after. Now, Mr. Walsh. The voice allowed no negotiation. This concerns the Apache situation. The line went dead. Trevor stared at his phone, then at the dark road stretching toward his next assignment. Colonel Hayes. He knew the name. Everyone on Fort Bragg knew Colonel Rebecca Hayes, the aviation commander whose reputation for competence and steel-spined determination preceded her like advance artillery. Whatever had prompted her personal call at 3:30 in the morning transcended anything a janitor should be involved with, unless someone had finally connected the dots. Unless someone had looked past the coveralls and seen the man underneath, the one Trevor had worked so hard to bury. He drove back to Hangar 7 with dread knotting his stomach. 2 military police vehicles sat in the parking lot, their light bars painting the night in alternating blue and red. This was worse than a forgotten mop bucket. This was official. This was the kind of attention Trevor had spent 6 years avoiding. Inside, the scene had transformed. The engineers were gone. In their place stood Colonel Hayes, flanked by 2 MPs and a civilian in expensive clothes whose posture screamed federal contractor. The woman turned when Trevor entered, and he felt her evaluation like physical pressure. She was younger than expected for her rank, maybe 40, with features that suggested equal parts intelligence and impatience. Her uniform bore the creases of someone who maintained standards even at ungodly hours. Mr. Walsh, thank you for returning. She gestured at the Apache. How long have you been cleaning this hangar? 5 years, ma'am. Trevor kept his voice neutral, his posture carefully slouched. The protective coloring of someone who'd learned that being forgettable was safer than being remembered. And in those 5 years, have you ever looked at the aircraft? Really looked, I mean. The question felt like a trap. Trevor measured his words carefully. I try to be careful around them, ma'am. They're expensive. Something flickered behind Colonel Hayes's eyes. Recognition or suspicion, Trevor couldn't tell which. I'm going to be direct, Mr. Walsh. That helicopter represents our sole operational Apache for the next 72 hours. Every other unit is deployed or down for scheduled maintenance. We have a rapid response mission that launches in 7 hours. Without that bird, American soldiers go into a hostile situation without air support. People die when air support fails. Trevor said nothing. He'd learned that silence was often the safest response. Hayes pulled out a tablet, turned it toward him. 20 minutes ago, I was reviewing security footage. Standard protocol when we have unexplained equipment failures. I noticed something interesting. She tapped the screen. The image showed Trevor pushing his mop cart past the engineers, pausing for perhaps 3 seconds to glance at the engine, then moving on. Most people, Hayes said quietly, see a broken helicopter and their eyes just slide past. But your body language in this footage suggests something different. You stopped. You looked. And in that look, I saw recognition. Trevor's pulse hammered in his ears. 6 years of carefully maintained anonymity unraveling because of 3 seconds captured on security footage. Ma'am, I don't understand. I ran your name through our database, Hayes interrupted. Trevor Walsh, 43 years old, employed in base maintenance for 5 years. Before that, scattered employment in manual labor positions. Nothing remarkable. She paused. Except Trevor Walsh is also the name of an aerospace engineer who specialized in rotorcraft systems, someone who held multiple patents, someone who gave presentations at industry conferences, someone who simply vanished from the aerospace sector in 2019 with no explanation. The federal contractor stepped forward, which raises significant security concerns. A former defense contractor with unexplained gaps in his employment history, working with access to sensitive military hardware. Trevor felt the walls closing in, not because they were wrong, but because they were right, and the truth was somehow more complicated than whatever they were imagining. My wife died, he said finally, the words scraping out like broken glass. 6 years ago. Car accident. After that, I couldn't do the work anymore. I needed something simple, something that let me stay near my son. Your son, Hayes said. Not a question. Randy. He's 9. He has a congenital heart defect. He needs surgery his insurance won't cover. This job gives me steady hours near the military hospital. That's all I needed. That's all I am now. The hangar fell silent except for the eternal hum of fluorescent lights. Colonel Hayes studied him with an expression Trevor couldn't parse. The federal contractor looked skeptical. The MPs maintained their alert posture, hands near their weapons, because apparently even a janitor could be threatening under the right circumstances. I'm sorry about your wife, Hayes said eventually, and your son, truly. But right now, I have a different problem. She gestured at the Apache. That engine has defeated every expert I've thrown at it. The mission window is closing, and I have security footage showing the only person in this building who looked at that helicopter and saw something everyone else missed. Trevor's mouth went dry. Ma'am, I'm not asking you to be an engineer again, Hayes said. I'm asking you to look at an engine and tell me what you see. 5 minutes. That's all. Then you can go back to your shift, and we'll never speak of this again. But if you walk out and soldiers die because I didn't ask the right questions, we'll both live with that knowledge. It was manipulation, elegant and effective. Hayes had identified his pressure points and applied leverage with surgical precision. But she wasn't entirely wrong. Trevor had already seen the problem, already knew what needed fixing. Walking away now meant choosing deliberate ignorance over competence, and that was a choice he'd spent 6 years pretending wasn't cowardice. If I look, he said carefully, what happens? To my job, I mean. Nothing, Hayes said. You keep cleaning hangars regardless of what you find or don't find. You have my word. Trevor closed his eyes, saw Randy's face in his hospital bed, pale and small and fighting for every breath. Saw the surgery bills that might as well be written in astronomical units for all the chance he had of paying them. Saw his wife Kelly's smile in the old photographs, the ones he couldn't look at anymore because they hurt too much. Saw, too, the faces of soldiers he'd never meet, waiting for support that wouldn't come because pride and pain had convinced him that being nobody was safer than being somebody who might fail. All right, he whispered. I'll look. Hayes nodded once, sharp with satisfaction. She stepped back, giving him space. The federal contractor watched with obvious suspicion. The MPs shifted their weight, ready to intervene if this strange janitor suddenly revealed himself to be a threat. Trevor approached the Apache slowly, each step feeling like walking toward an old life he'd murdered and tried to forget. He stopped at the engine compartment and forced himself to really see, not with the furtive glance of someone trying to remain invisible, but with the systematic analysis of an engineer trained to identify failure modes in complex systems. The turbine assembly gleamed under work lights. Everything appeared correct at first examination, the kind of correct that passed routine inspections, but hid problems underneath. Trevor's eyes tracked the cable routing, following paths he'd helped design years ago when he'd been someone who mattered. There, the mistake revealed itself in the relationship between components, in proximity that created interference, in the subtle ways that cost-cutting decisions in production undermined engineering intent. The turbine control unit isn't the problem, Trevor said, his voice stronger now, remembering the cadence of authority. It's testing normal because there's nothing wrong with it. The issue is electromagnetic interference from the avionics upgrade cables. See this routing? He pointed without touching. Those cables run too close to the fuel flow sensor. The sensor uses magnetic pickup technology. During startup, when the avionics power on, they create a variable electromagnetic field that corrupts the sensor reading. The control unit interprets this as a fuel flow problem and shuts down the turbine as a safety measure. Silence. The kind of silence that follows when someone says something that changes the entire frame of reference. Why didn't our diagnostics catch this? The federal contractor demanded. Because you ran diagnostics with the engine cold and avionics unpowered. The interference only manifests during the startup sequence when everything powers on simultaneously. Static testing misses dynamic problems. Colonel Hayes moved closer, examining the cable routing Trevor had indicated. How do we fix it? Trevor pulled out the small notebook he carried for tracking maintenance tasks. His hand moved almost of its own accord, sketching cable routes and shielding solutions, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought. Reroute these 3 cables through the upper channel. Add ferrite core shielding on the fuel sensor line. Test the startup sequence with full systems hot. It'll work. He handed the sketch to Hayes. She studied it, then studied him. You diagnosed in 3 minutes what stumped a team of senior engineers for 3 days. They were looking for broken components, Trevor said. Sometimes nothing's broken. Sometimes things are just having the wrong conversation with each other. The federal contractor grabbed the sketch, pulled out his phone, stepped away, making urgent calls. Colonel Hayes continued watching Trevor with those sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything. You designed this system, didn't you? Part of it. The fuel integration was my work. I specified shielded routing precisely to prevent this problem. Someone in production didn't follow the specifications. He looked at the Apache, seeing all the small compromises that separated the aircraft he'd designed from the one sitting before him. Cost savings. It happens. Why didn't you say something earlier, when you first saw the problem? Because then I'd have to be me again, Trevor said quietly. And I can't afford to be me. I need to be the guy who mops floors and doesn't ask for attention, the guy who stays near his son and doesn't have to answer questions about who he used to be. Hayes's expression shifted, something like understanding entering her features. And if I'd never called you back, then you'd have failed your mission, and I'd have lived with that, because I'm already living with worse. The federal contractor returned, his skepticism replaced with grudging respect. Boeing confirms. Dr. Walsh identified a known vulnerability that was supposed to be corrected in production. They're sending updated routing specifications now. He looked at Trevor with new calculation. They also said Dr. Walsh was the lead engineer on the next generation Apache proposal. Said his work was revolutionary. Said losing him was catastrophic for the program. I'm not interested, Trevor said immediately. I looked at your engine. I told you the problem. That's what you asked for. Mr. Walsh, Hayes began. Just Walsh. Or Trevor. I'm not Mr. Anything anymore. Trevor, then. Hayes moved to block his path to the door. You understand what you just did. You saved a mission. Potentially saved lives. That kind of expertise doesn't come along often. That kind of expertise also doesn't pay hospital bills regularly, Trevor countered. I have a job. It's not impressive, but it's stable. I need stable. What if I could offer you something better? There is nothing better, Trevor said flatly. Better pays more but costs more. More responsibility, more visibility, more ways to fail people who depend on me. I'm done with more. I'll take less if it means Randy gets to keep fighting. Hayes studied him for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had softened slightly. You're protecting him. By making yourself smaller, you think you're keeping him safer. I know I am. Are you? Hayes asked gently. Because from where I stand, you're teaching your son that talent should be hidden, that the proper response to tragedy is to diminish yourself. Is that really what you want him to learn? The question hit like a physical blow. Trevor felt something crack in his chest. You don't know anything about my son. No, Hayes agreed. But I know about sacrifice. I know what it looks like when good people try to protect those they love by giving up pieces of themselves. And I know it never ends the way we hope. She paused. How old is Randy? 9. Old enough to understand that his father is brilliant. Old enough to see that his father cleans floors. Old enough to wonder why the two don't match. Hayes, let that settle. I'm not asking you to abandon your son. I'm asking if maybe there's a way to be both the father he needs and the engineer you actually are. Trevor wanted to argue, wanted to walk away and return to his carefully constructed invisibility. But Hayes had identified something he'd tried not to see. Randy was old enough to understand. Old enough to ask questions, Trevor answered with increasingly transparent lies about how this job was fine, how they were fine, how everything would be fine when manifestly nothing was fine. What are you actually asking? Trevor said finally. For tonight? Help implement the fix you identified. Make sure it works. After that, we talk. No pressure. But maybe we explore whether being competent and being safe are actually mutually exclusive. Hayes's expression shifted to something almost human. I'm not trying to destroy the life you've built. I'm suggesting that maybe the life you've built is destroying you slowly, and maybe there's a third option. Trevor looked at the Apache, at the problem he'd diagnosed instantly, at the solution he'd sketched without thinking, looked at the federal contractor who was already organizing the repair, looked at Colonel Hayes, who somehow saw through 6 years of deliberate mediocrity to something underneath worth salvaging. He made a decision that terrified him. Okay, he said. I'll help with the fix. After that, I go back to my shift. I need time to think. Fair enough, Hayes said. She turned to the federal contractor. Give Dr. Walsh whatever he needs. The man hesitated. Ma'am, his security clearance. Was top secret with SCI access when he worked for Boeing? Hayes interrupted. I already checked. It's lapsed but can be reinstated. For tonight, he works under my direct authority. Questions? No one had questions. Trevor found himself suddenly surrounded by tools and specifications and engineering tablets he hadn't touched in 6 years. His hands remembered what his mind had tried to forget. Within 90 minutes, the cables were rerouted according to his design, the ferrite shielding installed, the engine reassembled under his supervision. At 5:45 in the morning, with dawn beginning to paint the eastern sky gray, they initiated the startup sequence. Trevor stood back, his heart hammering. If he was wrong, he just confirmed every fear that had driven him into hiding. If he was right, he'd proven that the person he'd tried to bury wasn't actually dead, just dormant. The turbine began its characteristic whine. Systems came online in cascading sequence, green lights appearing across the diagnostic panel like stars emerging at dusk. The engine caught, held, roared to life with the beautiful violence of controlled combustion doing exactly what it was designed to do. The hangar erupted in cheers. Engineers who'd returned for the test hugged each other. The federal contractor actually smiled. Colonel Hayes stood with arms crossed and satisfaction evident on her face. And Trevor Walsh, janitor and ghost, felt something he hadn't felt in 6 years. Pride. Pure, uncomplicated pride in work done well. Hayes approached as the engine powered down for post-test inspection. Thank you, she said simply. You just saved lives. I hope you understand that. I understand, Trevor said. He did. Could feel it settling into his bones, both the weight and the strange lightness of it. Will you at least think about talking? About possibilities? Trevor looked at his coveralls, his mop cart waiting by the door, his ancient truck visible through the windows. Looked at the Apache, magnificent and deadly, and fixed. Looked at his hands, still capable after all these years. Yeah, he said quietly. I'll think about it. Good. Hayes handed him a business card with her direct number. Call when you're ready. Or don't. Either way, what you did tonight matters. Remember that. Trevor took the card, tucked it into his pocket next to the hospital bracelet he carried as a talisman, the one with Randy's name and medical record number. Then he walked back to his mop cart, pushed it out of the hangar, and tried to continue his shift. But something fundamental had shifted. The invisibility didn't fit quite right anymore. And for the first time in 6 years, Trevor Walsh wasn't entirely certain that was a bad thing. Word count to 3,000. Đã hoàn thành 3.000 từ đầu tiên. Dừng lại để thông báo. Tôi đã viết xong 3.000 từ đầu tiên của kịch bản hoàn toàn mới. Phần này bao gồm Hook giữ nguyên như đã chốt. Phần 1. Mở đồ. Trevor làm janitor. Bối cảnh động cơ hỏng. Phần 2. Biến cố. Colonel Hayes gọi Trevor. Phát hiện quá khứ. Phần 3. Leo thang bắt đầu. Trevor chẩn đoán và sửa thành công. Bạn có muốn tôi viết tiếp 3.000 từ còn lại để hoàn thiện câu chuyện không? Tiếp theo phần 1, 3.000 từ cuối. The hospital corridor stretched endless under fluorescent lights that turned everything the color of sickness. Trevor arrived at 6:45, 15 minutes later than usual, carrying Randy's breakfast in a paper bag already going translucent with grease. His hands still bore traces of the Apache repair, engine oil dark under his fingernails despite 20 minutes of scrubbing, evidence of competence he couldn't quite wash away. Patricia, the morning shift nurse, looked up from her station with an expression Trevor had learned to read instantly. Something was wrong. He had episodes during the night, she said gently. 3 separate incidents where his oxygen saturation dropped below safe levels. Dr. Reeves is with him now. The breakfast bag slipped from Trevor's fingers. He barely noticed. The world had narrowed to a single point of terror, sharp and bright and utterly familiar. This was the call he'd been expecting for months, the one that arrived in the middle of ordinary moments and shattered them into pieces too small to reassemble. He ran. Down the corridor, past rooms where other families faced their own private catastrophes, to the door with Randy's name on a placard decorated with stickers his son had chosen himself. Dinosaurs and rockets and helicopters, because even a failing heart couldn't kill a 9-year-old's fascination with things that flew. Dr. Reeves stood beside Randy's bed, adjusting medication drips with movements that spoke of controlled urgency. Randy lay pale against white sheets, oxygen mask covering half his small face, monitors beeping their anxious rhythm. But his eyes were open, and when he saw Trevor, they managed something almost like a smile. "Dad," he whispered, the word muffled by the mask. "You're late." Trevor moved to the bedside, took his son's hand with a gentleness born of terror. Randy's fingers felt cold, small, fragile in ways that made Trevor's chest constrict. "I got held up at work," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I'm sorry." Dr. Reeves finished with the IV, then turned to face Trevor with the expression medical professionals wear when delivering news that will hurt. "Mr. Walsh, we need to talk. Randy's condition has accelerated significantly. The surgery can't wait any longer. We're looking at weeks now, not months. Possibly days if he has another episode like last night." The world tilted. Trevor gripped the bed rail to keep from falling. "But the waiting list..." "We can bypass the list under emergency protocols," Dr. Reeves interrupted. "But that requires full payment guarantee before we can schedule. The surgery, the cardiac team, the post-operative care, all of it needs to be secured up front for emergency cases. I know that's not what you want to hear, but those are the realities we're facing. $120,000. The number that had haunted Trevor's dreams for 5 years. The impossible sum that stood between his son's life and his son's death. He'd saved $19,000 through brutal economy, living in the cheapest apartment Fort Bragg allowed, eating meals that cost less than the gas to drive to work. At his current salary, he'd need another decade to reach the goal. Randy didn't have a decade, didn't have a year, might not have weeks. "How long?" Trevor asked, his voice barely functional. "How long before we have to decide?" "The surgery team needs 48 hours' notice to assemble. Given Randy's current trajectory, I'd recommend making a decision within the next 24 hours. Dr. Reeves's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walsh. I know this isn't fair, but waiting longer significantly increases the surgical risk." She left them alone then, understanding perhaps that some moments required privacy, even in hospitals where privacy was an illusion. Trevor sat on the edge of Randy's bed, careful not to disturb the forest of tubes and wires keeping his son alive. Randy reached up and pulled down his oxygen mask, ignoring the monitor alarms that immediately started beeping. "Dad," he said, his voice thin but determined. "I heard what she said. About the money. Don't worry about that," Trevor said automatically. "I'll figure something out." "How?" Randy's eyes, Kelly's eyes, looked at him with a clarity that broke Trevor's heart. "You've been trying to figure it out for 5 years. There's no magic solution. We both know that. Trevor wanted to argue, wanted to promise that everything would be fine, that he'd find a way, that faith and determination could somehow transmute poverty into salvation. But Randy was 9 years old and dying, and he deserved better than comfortable lies. "I don't know," Trevor admitted, "but I won't let you die because of money. I won't." Randy's hand tightened on his. "The lady last night, Colonel Hayes, she wanted to offer you something, didn't she? Something about being an engineer again." Trevor froze. He hadn't mentioned Hayes's hints to Randy, hadn't planned to until he'd processed what they might mean. "How did you left your phone on the table when you went to the bathroom. It rang. I answered it." Randy had the grace to look slightly guilty. "She said she needed to talk to you, that she had a proposition that could help us." She sounded important. The business card in Trevor's pocket felt like it weighed 10 pounds. He pulled it out, stared at the printed name and phone number. "Colonel Rebecca Hayes, Commander, Aviation Regiment. Direct line." "She wants me to consult," he said slowly. "Use my engineering background to solve problems for the base. Would it pay enough? For the surgery? I don't know. Maybe." She said we'd talk. Trevor looked at his son, at the hospital room that had become their entire world, at the impossible choice crystallizing before him. But that means going back to being an engineer, means being visible again, means risking failure. "You already failed," Randy said quietly. "You failed at hiding. You failed at pretending you're not brilliant. Last night proved that. You looked at a helicopter and fixed it in minutes. That's not failure, Dad. That's who you are." Trevor felt tears burning behind his eyes. "Your mother would want me to live," Randy interrupted. "She'd want you to live too. Not just survive, actually live. Be the person you're supposed to be." He pulled his oxygen mask back up, breathing hard from the exertion of speaking, but his eyes remained fixed on Trevor's face. "Call her, Dad, please, before it's too late." Trevor sat in the hospital parking lot, phone in hand, business card in the other, paralyzed by a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Call Hayes and risk everything he'd built over 6 years of careful anonymity. Don't call and watch his son die, because pride and fear mattered more than solutions. Some decisions were terrible precisely because they were obvious. He dialed. Hayes answered on the second ring. "Trevor, I was hoping you'd call." Her voice carried none of the surprise people usually employed when receiving unexpected calls. She'd been waiting. "How's your son?" "Dying faster than expected. I need the surgery within weeks, which means I need money I don't have." Trevor closed his eyes. "You said you had a proposition. I'm listening. Can you come to my office? This conversation needs to happen face to face." Trevor looked at the hospital building behind him, at the window that marked Randy's room. "When?" "Now, if possible. This is time-sensitive for both of us." Hayes's office occupied the 3rd floor of the Aviation Regiment headquarters, a space that managed to be both functional and intimidating. Certificates and commendations covered one wall. The opposite wall displayed photographs of Hayes in various combat zones, standing beside helicopters, shaking hands with generals whose stars outnumbered their years of experience. A woman who'd earned her authority through competence in situations where incompetence meant death. She gestured Trevor to a chair, settled behind her desk with the controlled movements of someone who'd learned efficiency in cockpits where wasted motion could prove fatal. "I'll be direct," she said. "Last night proved something I suspected but couldn't confirm. You're still one of the best rotorcraft engineers in the country, possibly the best, and I need that expertise." "For what?" Trevor asked. Hayes pulled out a folder, opened it to reveal photographs and technical documents. "Our Apache fleet is aging. We're seeing failure patterns that our standard maintenance protocols aren't catching. Small problems that compound into mission failures. Nothing catastrophic yet, but we're trending that direction. I need someone who can look at these systems with fresh eyes, someone who understands them at a fundamental level." She looked up from the folder. "I need you," You have engineers. You have contractors. You have people who follow checklists, Hayes interrupted. People who are very good at implementing solutions to known problems. What I don't have is someone who can identify problems before they become catastrophic. Someone who can see patterns in apparently unrelated failures. Someone who proved last night that he can diagnose issues that stump teams of specialists. Trevor stared at the photographs in the folder. Apache helicopters in various states of maintenance, technical readouts showing performance degradation, failure analysis reports marked with red flags. His engineer's brain began parsing the data automatically, seeing connections, identifying patterns. He forced himself to look away. What exactly are you offering? Hayes slid a document across the desk. Contract consulting position. 20 hours per week minimum. Flexible scheduling to accommodate your son's needs. Primary focus on diagnostic analysis and failure prediction. Some hands-on work, mostly systems review and recommendation. She paused. Starting salary of $98,000 annually, with performance incentives, full family health coverage that includes pre-existing conditions. Coverage begins immediately upon contract signature. The numbers hit like physical blows. $98,000, more than 3 times his current salary. Health coverage that would include Randy's surgery. The difference between death and life, printed on paper and offered across a desk by a woman who'd spent maybe 6 hours knowing he existed. Why? Trevor whispered. Why would you offer this? Because I need you, Hayes said simply. And because I read the accident report from 6 years ago. I know what happened to your wife. I know about the steering linkage failure. I also know about the manufacturer's recall that came 6 months too late. She leaned forward slightly. Kelly's death wasn't your fault, Trevor. It was mechanical failure and corporate negligence and terrible luck. But it wasn't you being unable to save her. You couldn't have prevented it. The words struck something deep in Trevor's chest that he'd tried to wall off for 6 years. The fundamental belief that his engineering expertise should have somehow translated into the ability to keep his wife alive. That being brilliant with machines meant he should have been able to protect the person he loved most. The guilt that had driven him to make himself small, to hide his competence, to punish himself by becoming invisible. I didn't know about the recall, he said hollowly. I know, because you were too consumed by grief to investigate. Too busy blaming yourself to look at the actual evidence. Hayes's voice gentled. You're not responsible for Kelly's death. You're responsible for Randy's life. And right now, that means making a choice about whether pride matters more than your son's survival. Trevor looked at the contract, at the salary figure, at the health coverage terms, looked at the business card he'd carried in his pocket like a talisman of possibility, looked at his hands, oil-stained from the Apache repair, still capable after 6 years of deliberate disuse. If I take this, he said slowly, I need absolute clarity on one thing. Randy comes first, always, no exceptions. If he needs me, I walk away from whatever I'm doing, mission critical or not. Agreed, Hayes said immediately. That's written into the contract. Family medical emergency clause with no questions asked and no impact on your employment status. And if I'm not as good as you think. If 6 years of pushing a mop cart has made me too rusty. Hayes smiled slightly. Then we'll deal with it. But Trevor, you diagnosed and fixed a problem in 3 hours that had defeated multiple engineering teams for 3 days, while pretending to be a janitor. While exhausted and worried about your son, I'm not particularly concerned about your competence. Trevor picked up the contract, read through it with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that details mattered, that small print could contain catastrophes, that promises on paper meant nothing without precision. But the terms were exactly what Hayes had described. Clear, fair, weighted heavily in his favor with protections for Randy's needs built into every clause. This wasn't charity disguised as employment. This was legitimate work with compensation appropriate to his expertise. When do you need an answer? He asked. Now, Hayes said. Not to pressure you, but your son's doctor called me this morning. She explained the timeline. 48 hours to assemble the surgical team. which means you need to make financial arrangements within 24 hours. This contract provides immediate health coverage. Sign it today, and I can have Randy's surgery approved by this afternoon. Trevor's hands shook on the paper. 6 years of hiding, of making himself small, of believing that being invisible was the same as being safe. 6 years of watching his son slowly die while Trevor punished himself for failures that apparently weren't even his fault. And here was the exit. Clear and obvious and terrifying precisely because it meant admitting that everything he'd done since Kelly's death had been wrong. "You understand what you're asking?" Trevor said quietly. "You're asking me to stop being the person I've been for 6 years, to admit that hiding was the wrong choice, that I've wasted all this time being less than I should have been." "No," Hayes said firmly. "I'm asking you to recognize that grief makes us do things that don't serve us. That 6 years ago, you made the best choice you could with the emotional resources you had. But circumstances change. Randy is dying. You have the ability to save him if you're willing to let yourself be competent again." She paused. "This isn't about admitting failure. It's about recognizing that what served you then doesn't serve you now." Trevor thought about Randy's words. "You already failed at hiding." Thought about the pride he'd felt when the Apache engine roared to life. Thought about Kelly's voice in old memories, telling him he was magic with broken things. Thought about the choice that wasn't really a choice, because choosing pride over Randy's life wasn't actually a choice at all. "I need a pen," he said. Hayes handed him one. Trevor signed the contract with a hand that shook but didn't hesitate. His signature looked strange after 6 years of signing nothing more important than maintenance logs. Dr. Trevor Walsh, returning from the dead through necessity and fear and the absolute requirement that his son survive. "Welcome back," Hayes said, extending her hand. "I think you're going to do extraordinary things." Trevor shook her hand, felt the title settle over him like a coat he'd forgotten he owned. Dr. Walsh. Not just Trevor. Not just the invisible janitor. Someone who mattered, who contributed, who might actually make a difference. The thought terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. 3 hours later, Trevor sat in Dr. Reeves's office while she explained the surgical procedure Randy would undergo in 48 hours. The cardiac team was already assembling. The operating room reserved. The post-operative care arranged. All of it made possible by a contract signature and health insurance that covered pre-existing conditions because Colonel Hayes had made it her personal mission to ensure Trevor's son survived. "The surgery has significant risks," Dr. Reeves explained, her voice professional but not unkind. "Randy's heart is severely compromised. We'll be essentially rebuilding the damaged structures. But the alternative is certain death within weeks. Possibly days. The choice, such as it is, seems clear." "When?" Trevor asked. "Day after tomorrow, 7 a.m. We'll prep him starting the night before. The procedure takes 6 to 8 hours. Recovery will be intensive, but if successful, Randy should have normal cardiac function within 6 months." She paused. "I won't promise miracles, Mr. Walsh, but I will promise that he has the best chance he's going to get." Trevor walked back to Randy's room in a daze, the surgery consent forms in his hand, the weight of the next 48 hours pressing down like atmosphere. Randy was awake, oxygen mask pushed down, eyes bright with hope and fear mixed into something that looked too old for a 9-year-old face. "You signed it," Randy said. "Not a question." "I signed it. The surgery is day after tomorrow. Dr. Reeves says you have a good chance." Trevor sat on the bed, took his son's hand. "You scared?" "Terrified," Randy admitted. "But also kind of relieved? Like, we've been waiting for this for so long, and now it's finally happening. That's good, right?" "That's good," Trevor agreed, though his own terror was vast enough to drown in. "Randy, I need to tell you something. About your mom. About the accident." He told his son everything Hayes had revealed. The steering linkage failure. The manufacturer's recall that came too late. The 17 other vehicles with the same defect. 3 more people dead from the same mechanical failure. The truth that Kelly's death wasn't Trevor's fault, wasn't preventable, wasn't punishment for some fundamental inadequacy in his ability to protect the people he loved. Randy listened with the seriousness of a child who'd spent too much time in hospitals, who understood that adult problems didn't always have solutions, who'd learned to process information that should have been years beyond his comprehension. When Trevor finished, Randy was crying silently, tears tracking down his pale cheeks. "So you've been hiding for no reason," Randy whispered. "All this time you thought you failed, Mom. But you didn't. It wasn't your fault." "No," Trevor said, the admission cracking something open in his chest. "It wasn't my fault. I just couldn't see that through the grief." "Mom wouldn't have wanted you to hide," Randy said. "She would have wanted you to keep being brilliant, to keep fixing broken things, to keep being the person she fell in love with." He gripped Trevor's hand tighter. "Promise me something, Dad. Promise that after my surgery, after I get better, you'll stop hiding. You'll be the engineer you're supposed to be. Not because you have to, but because you want to. Because being brilliant isn't something to be ashamed of." Trevor pulled his son into a careful hug, mindful of tubes and wires, and felt 6 years of carefully maintained walls finally crumble completely. "I promise," he whispered. "I promise I'll stop hiding. I'll be the father you deserve by being the person I actually am." They held each other while monitors beeped and the hospital conducted its endless rhythms around them. Trevor felt grief and relief and terror mixing into something he couldn't name, some emotion that came from standing at the intersection of everything he'd lost and everything he might still save. Kelly was gone. Randy was here. The future was uncertain but no longer impossible. And Trevor Walsh, engineer and father, was finally allowing himself to be both things at once. The surgery happened on a Thursday morning that dawned clear and cold. Trevor held Randy's hand while they wheeled him to the operating room, walked beside the gurney until the surgical doors closed and left him standing alone in a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and anxiety. Colonel Hayes arrived 20 minutes later, brought coffee and silence, sat with him in the waiting room where other families conducted their own vigils. Hours passed with the weight of geological time. Sunrise became morning, became afternoon. Nurses appeared periodically with updates that contained no real information. The surgery was proceeding. Randy was stable. The team was working. Wait longer. Other people came and went from the waiting room, some leaving with joy, others with devastation. Trevor existed in a space beyond emotion, his entire being focused on a single point: the moment when someone would emerge and tell him whether his son would live. At 2:37 in the afternoon, Dr. Reeves pushed through the surgical doors, still wearing her operating scrubs. Her face was tired, but her eyes were clear. Trevor stood so fast his vision grayed at the edges. "He made it," Dr. Reeves said, and Trevor's legs gave out. Hayes caught him, helped him back into the chair. "The surgery was successful. We repaired the damaged structures and reinforced the compromised areas. His heart is functioning normally. He's in recovery now. It'll be touch and go for the next 48 hours, but all the indicators are positive." Trevor couldn't speak, couldn't process, could only sit there while relief crashed over him in waves that felt like drowning in reverse, like surfacing from depths he'd been trapped under for 6 years. Hayes's hand on his shoulder was the only thing that felt real. "Can I see him?" Trevor finally managed. "Give the recovery team another hour to stabilize him. Then, yes, he'll be sedated for the next several hours, but you can be there when he wakes up." Dr. Reeves smiled, tired but genuine. "Your son is incredibly strong, Mr. Walsh. He fought hard today, and he won." Trevor saw Randy 6 hours later, in a recovery room surrounded by enough medical equipment to launch a spacecraft. His son looked small and pale and utterly vulnerable, chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance, monitors displaying heartbeats that were finally, miraculously normal. Trevor sat beside the bed and took Randy's hand and cried for the first time since Kelly's funeral. Cried for everything lost and everything saved and everything that might still be possible if he could find the courage to keep moving forward. Randy woke the next morning, groggy and disoriented but alive. His first words were, "Did it work?" And Trevor's response of, "Yes, it worked," sent Randy back to sleep with a smile on his face. Recovery was slow and painful, and marked by small victories measured in heartbeats and oxygen saturation levels and hours without complications. But Randy was alive, getting stronger, beginning the long climb back toward health. Trevor spent his days at the hospital and his nights in the small apartment that no longer felt like enough. On the fourth day after surgery, while Randy slept peacefully, Hayes appeared with a tablet and an expression that suggested business mixed with compassion. "I need you to start working," she said without preamble. "Not immediately, but soon. We have problems that need your expertise, and waiting isn't helping anyone." "Randy needs me," Trevor said automatically. "Randy needs you to be whole," Hayes corrected. "And part of being whole means doing the work you're designed to do. We can arrange flexible scheduling. You work when Randy doesn't need you. You stop when he does." But Trevor, hiding in this hospital room isn't helping him heal. It's just teaching him that fear should define our choices. She was right. Trevor hated that she was right. But the truth was undeniable. Randy was healing. The worst danger had passed. And sitting vigil 24 hours a day wasn't parenting. It was anxiety masquerading as devotion. "What do you need?" Trevor asked. Hayes showed him the tablet. Failure reports from the Apache fleet. Maintenance logs showing patterns, small problems compounding into larger ones. Work that required someone who could see the forest, instead of just cataloging trees. "Start with analysis. Work from here if you need to. Just help me understand what we're missing." Trevor took the tablet, began scrolling through data that his engineer's brain parsed automatically. Within 20 minutes, he'd identified 3 potential failure modes that standard maintenance wasn't catching. Within an hour, he'd drafted preliminary recommendations. The work felt good, felt right, felt like using muscles that had atrophied from disuse. And when Randy woke and saw his father working on something that clearly mattered, his smile suggested pride rather than abandonment. "You're being brilliant again," Randy said, his voice still weak but his eyes bright. "Mom would be happy." "Yeah," Trevor agreed. "I think she would be." 2 months later, Trevor stood in Hangar 7 watching a maintenance team implement modifications he'd designed. The Apache fleet was more reliable now, safer, better. His diagnostic protocols were catching problems before they became catastrophic. Soldiers were flying missions with equipment Trevor had personally certified. Lives were being saved not through dramatic repairs, but through systematic excellence that prevented failures before they occurred. Randy had been discharged 3 weeks earlier, was attending school again, was playing with other children like his heart had never been damaged at all. Dr. Reeves called it miraculous. Trevor called it the natural consequence of finally making the right choice. His son was alive because Trevor had stopped hiding, had accepted help, had allowed himself to be competent again. Colonel Hayes found him there in the hangar, as she often did, observing his work with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd learned to take pride in expertise again. "How's Randy?" she asked. "Amazing. His cardiologist says his heart function is better than expected, talking about him trying out for soccer in the fall." Trevor smiled. "He wants to be an engineer now. Says if his dad can fix helicopters, maybe he can fix hearts. Following in your footsteps." "Better than that," Trevor said, following in his own direction. "But not afraid of being brilliant while doing it. That's the difference." Hayes nodded. "You did good work here, Trevor. Not just with the helicopters, with yourself. With Randy. You stopped hiding. That takes real courage." Trevor thought about that. About the night 6 years ago when grief had convinced him that being small was the same as being safe. About the morning in this hangar when a broken engine had reminded him that competence doesn't disappear just because you bury it. About Randy's voice saying, "I don't want you to be a janitor because of me." About choosing to be visible again, to be vulnerable, to risk failure because the alternative was choosing death. "You know what I told Randy yesterday?" Trevor asked. He asked what I'd say to someone who was hiding their talents because they were afraid. Someone who thought being invisible was safer than being seen. What did you tell him? I told him that invisible people don't change the world. That fear is understandable, but it's not a strategy. That the things we're brilliant at, those aren't luxuries we can afford to waste. Because somewhere, someone needs exactly what we have to offer. Trevor looked at the Apache, at the work he'd done, at the future that had opened when he'd finally forgiven himself. And I told him I finally believed it. Good, Hayes said, because I have another problem that needs your particular kind of magic. Interested? Always, Trevor said, and he meant it. That evening, Trevor picked Randy up from his first full day back at school. His son ran to the car with the boundless energy of a child whose body finally worked right, backpack bouncing, smile wide and real. Kelly's smile, alive in the boy they'd made together, continuing forward into a future neither of them had dared imagine months ago. Dad, guess what? Randy climbed into the car, still talking. My teacher asked what you do, and I said you're an aerospace engineer who fixes helicopters and designs systems that save soldiers' lives, and everyone thought that was really cool, and I thought, yeah, my dad is pretty amazing. Trevor sat in the driver's seat of the reliable car he could finally afford, looked at his son who was alive and healthy and proud of his father, thought about the work waiting for him tomorrow that mattered and challenged and made the world incrementally better, thought about Kelly and how she'd told him once that being brilliant wasn't about never failing, it was about getting back up after you did and trying again. Not amazing, he said, starting the engine. Just finally honest about who I am. That's all. Mom used to say something like that, Randy said quietly. She said the bravest thing was being yourself even when it was scary. Your mom was a wise woman. Yeah, I think she'd be proud of you. Of both of us. Randy buckled his seatbelt. Hey, Dad, can we celebrate tonight? I want pizza. What are we celebrating? Being brave? Being ourselves? Being alive? Randy grinned. I think that's worth celebrating. Trevor laughed, genuine and full. Yeah, buddy, that's definitely worth celebrating. They drove toward home through the evening that smelled of possibility, Fort Bragg conducting its eternal operations behind them. The future uncertain but no longer impossible stretching ahead. The invisible man was gone. Dr. Trevor Walsh had returned. And somewhere, Kelly was smiling at what they'd become, at how they'd survived, at how love and courage and the simple act of choosing competence over fear had saved them both. The world was better for it. And Trevor Walsh, engineer and father, was finally whole.